My name is Barbara Altman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, and I'm very happy to be the first to welcome you to this evening's talk. It's the fourth in a series of 6 celebrating the bicentennial of Charles Darwin and the sesquicentennial of his landmark book On the Origin of Species. Our series has included 4 faculty members from UO. We began with Patrick Phillips in January, and then we heard Warren Holmes in February, Joe Thornton in March, and tonight our presenter is Professor Frances White from the Department of Anthropology and Institute for Cognitive and Decision Sciences. In May, we'll bring the series to a close with 2 outside speakers. The first of those is Sean Carroll from the University of Wisconsin, who will be here on May 4th as the Oregon Humanities Center 2008-2009 Robert D. Clark Lecturer. And closing the series will be Professor Kenneth Miller from Brown University, who will deliver the OHC's 2008-9 Criticos Lecture on May 27th. I know some of you are repeat visitors for this series, so I hope you'll continue and stick through the rest with us. Tonight's is going to be brilliant, and the last 2 should be almost as good, so we invite you to keep coming. I'm going to be brief because I'm just the first of 2 introducers. The Oregon Humanities Center, my unit, is one of the co-sponsors of this event, but there are many others. They are the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, the Institute of Molecular Biology, the Institute of Neuroscience, the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, the Department of Biology, and the College of Arts and Sciences. We're especially pleased at the Humanities Center to be working on these lectures and a number of other projects with the natural sciences this year. I want to acknowledge our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, who enthusiastically leapt at the chance to collaborate on this series when the idea came up. I also want to thank the other members of the OHC staff for all their hard work, including our beautiful poster, which I'm sure you've seen around. So much appreciation to Melissa Gustafson, Peg Gearhart, Dylan Bragg, and Noel Alloy. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture, and I'm sure you will, have a look at that beautiful poster when you have a minute and make note of the dates of those last 2 speakers. You can also find all of the relevant information whenever you need it on the website of the Oregon Humanities Center. I've also been asked by colleagues to announce a lecture that is not part of our series, but might as well have been. On Thursday, April 30th, there will be a lecture by Philip Gingerich, Case College, Professor of Paleontology, Professor of Geological Sciences, and Director of the Museum of Paleontology at the University of Michigan. His talk will be called The Origin and Early Evolution of Whales, a Profound Transition from Land to Sea. His lecture is being sponsored by Phi Beta Kappa, and to repeat the date, the event will take place on Thursday, April the 30th, 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. in 180 PLC. You can call the Department of History if you forget that, and they'll repeat the information for you. For now, however, we have bonobos to attend to. So without further ado, let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's get to that good stuff. Allow me to introduce our next introducer. This is Associate Dean Larry Singal, who will present our speaker. Welcome.
Thank you. As Barbara said, my name is Larry Singal, and you can tell that I'm an Associate Dean of Social Sciences because I'm the one person who felt compelled in the evolutionary scale to wear a tie. I don't know exactly where that places me in here, but hopefully I'll survive. In any case, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Frances White, who is a professor of anthropology and also the director of the Institute of Cognitive and Decision Sciences. Tonight, Dr. White is going to talk to us about Make Love, Not War, what chimpanzees can tell us about the evolution of human behavior. Now, as an economics professor, I had always imagined the possibility of putting making love in one of my lectures and the potential interest it might generate. And I can see from all your smiling faces that this might work for me. It certainly worked for you. Well done. But in all seriousness, what we're going to hear about this evening is no monkey business. I've been recently reading the book Collapse by anthropologist and geographer Jared Diamond, and he argues that we can learn from societal collapses of the past. Indeed, he contends that those societies that can learn, effectively adapt, survive, and those that do not collapse. It's not surprising that other animals, particularly those that are similar to us, face similar evolutionary societies, and those that evolve effective coping mechanisms survive. Frances White is going to give us an example of a member of the ape family, the bonobo family, or as she lovingly calls the hippie ape. And they've discovered that making love, and not war, can be a successful means of resolving disputes. This suggests that both human evolutionary past and even perhaps our evolutionary future may include wider possibilities. So let's welcome Professor White.
So first I should make sure that everybody could hear me. I usually, when I lecture in this room, which is most of winter term, I always go, "Can you hear me in the back?" So, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk and for organizing this series, because talking about the importance of evolution is something that is so very near and dear to my heart, and something that I feel we don't do enough of, and we should be doing more to reach out and to talk about the role that evolution has played in the evolution of humans, us, as well as its relevance to everyday life. So evolution is something that is continuing, it doesn't stop, and it can add a value of interpretation and understanding to many of the things that go on in today's world. And of course, we're here to celebrate Darwin's birthday, and I didn't want to put the party hat on that we've seen in some of the pictures, but the point that I want to make actually today is I'm going to take a slightly different track, and rather than talk about the origin of species, I'm going to talk about another major work of Darwin, or leading on from another major work of Darwin, and that was one that was published in 1871, which is The Descent of Man. And this is essentially the Darwin's bringing together a lot of the discussions that happened after The Origin of Species was written, with all the discussions about what this evolutionary theory meant to the thinking of how humans evolved. So that after this debate had been going on for some time, he produced this volume, and especially incorporating the importance of that part of evolution called sexual selection, which is what I'll be talking about a fair amount today. And of course, the importance of Darwin's work has been expounded upon by many, but of course it also caused a massive reaction, and probably nothing was as big a reaction as the impact that it had in understanding the origin of humans and then humans' relationship to apes. The writing under this one I cannot read because it's out of focus, but it's essentially from a Punch cartoon that came out after the publication of Origin of Species, typifying the reaction or the shock to the idea that humans could be related to or descended from an ape ancestor. Of course, today, probably we're a little more accepting. And I think this is definitely good. But not as accepting as perhaps we would all like. This is one of the warning stickers that was placed on textbooks, biology textbooks that contain teaching on evolutionary theory at high school level, and it reads, "This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered." Now, I didn't quite have the bumper sticker that many of you may have known followed this, which went, "Evolution is a theory, just like gravity." But it is true that there have been many challenges to the teaching of evolution. Some of the students that come into our introductory classes have not had a solid grounding in evolution, and many of them find that first step of accepting and understanding evolutionary theory quite difficult. As we always emphasize, this is understanding a theory, essentially a mechanistic system that if a behavior is heritable in any way and it is successful, it will be passed on and spread to future generations. You understand the mechanism. We're not talking about a belief system. But of course, the reaction then to this is essentially to attack back, as you would expect, so that much of the criticisms of teaching evolution have brought up not necessarily a creationist base, but an intelligent design base. And of course, evolutionists then counter that with, you may have heard of, the flying spaghetti monster. The proposal being that equally important to teach, if you're going to teach creationism and intelligent design, you need to teach the belief that the world and man was created by the giant flying spaghetti monster. Point being that creationism and intelligent design are not scientific theories, they are belief systems. What we're talking here out is a scientific theory with testable hypotheses that we can propose and examine and refine. And as data is continued, we have more information to look at this. And this would be my favorite t-shirt. The point being that what I want to talk about today especially is the perspective that looking at bonobos and bonobo behavior brings to this whole examination of the evolution of humans and human behavior. So what I'm going to try to do today is, in a sort of fairly general setting, and introduce as well as I can some perspectives on human evolution, specifically looking at the role of sexual selection as introduced by Darwin or emphasized by Darwin in his volume. And I'm going to pick some areas to examine. One of them is going to be sexual dimorphism, or body size, which we've got some examples here that we can talk about as we go. But especially how then sexual dimorphism impacts behavior. Now, often in, as I'd like to talk a little bit about when we're talking about the evolution of humans, there are two big areas that we often refer to. One of them is the evolution of human morphology, our shape and size, and the other is the evolution of human behavior. So I'm going to start with sexual dimorphism as morphology, and that's generally more accepted, but I'm going to expand it into behavior and talk about how this reflects then on the relationship between males and females within a species. I'm also going to talk about the ancestral human mating system. So the idea here is that when discussions started talking about the evolution of humans, one of the first areas that people wanted to address is how did we first evolve? What were we like? What was our social system? And I want to talk just a little bit about the history of that and set up essentially some hypotheses that are still current today and being used at various introductory textbooks, for example, talking about how humans may or may not be monogamous as a species, typical trait. And related to that, it may not quite make sense here, but I want to talk about the role of male aggression and the role of male aggression in human evolution, but especially bringing in some of the more recent information that's been found on chimpanzee social behavior and the role of aggression in the interaction between chimpanzee groups. And also tied to this then, one element of the behavior that is very important is sexuality, and human sexuality as different from non-human primate or ape sexuality, as well as sexuality of other primates or other mammals, and how humans are different. And again, this is very much a part of the original hypotheses that were developed, especially in the 60s through the 70s, looking at what was the ancestral human like in its behavior. And of course, all through this, I'm going to be talking about bonobos, so I'm going to spend some time just talking about the field work that I do on bonobos. And that film, the work is available if you're interested in a wonderful video called The Last Great Ape, made by Nova. But I put this up because there's one really important part of this video that I need you to pay attention to. It's my favorite part. It comes right at the beginning. and it's the PG-13 rating or whatever it is. The point here being actually not that I'll be using, well, there's a little bit of explicit visual material, as well as some references that we're making, but we're talking biology here, just to warn you. So that when we're talking about the evolution of humans, we're talking about we're talking about a history of which we know nothing about the middle. We know what we're like. We know that how humans behave today. We know the variety of human behavior across a variety of human cultures. We also know what modern apes do. So when we're talking about chimpanzees, bonobos, and including gorillas, we're talking about modern animals. If we're trying to work out what was important during human evolution or what humans may have done, we essentially have to use a comparative approach. We have to look at how behaviors have evolved in different animals, different primates, especially using our closest relatives, the apes, and also, by extension, out to monkeys and other non-human primates. Today, I'm going to stick very much as, within the apes. But essentially, by identifying an evolutionary significance of a particular trait, be it morphological or be it behavioral, in other words, understanding how it evolved in one system, if we find the same trait in another system, in this case humans, we can at least infer that it may have evolved under the same pressures. We can potentially then generate hypotheses to test some of these aspects. But the idea being that we're looking for similar things occurring in a variety of different species, trying to draw parallels on the evolutionary trajectory. But of course, we have to recognize that we are not evolved from chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas. These are modern animals that are living today, just like us. It's that we all shared a common ancestor some time ago. So there was an animal around, we're talking 5 to 7 million years ago, that we're all descended from. So traits that occur in gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and us would presumably be in this common ancestor, and any trait that any one of us had could also potentially be in that common ancestor. Obviously, ones that are evolved over time away from that common ancestor that makes us different to chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas are ones that are going to be unique to human evolution. So starting with sexual selection, and I kind of dimmed out some words here. They'll come back bright in a minute when I've described what I'm talking about, but just to give them a placeholder. So I'm going to start by talking about sexual selection of body size. And we generally talk about two types of sexual selection. When we're talking about sexual selection, we're talking about the evolution of traits that especially focus or benefit reproductive success, reproduction, not survival, or not necessarily survival. Or they could actually be really bad for survival. But if they help you reproduce, and therefore you carry those traits onto the next generation, they could spread and become very abundant. And we all see examples of sexual selection all the time. They're traits that are very important in reproducing. And often they can be quite dangerous. I'm sure every one of you has almost hit some late teenager walking across the road with a cell phone glued to their ear, right? They pay no attention to traffic. They're really busy on that phone. If they are arranging their date for that night, they are focusing on their reproductive success. They are not thinking about survival. They're not thinking about getting across that road. That's sexual selection, and it's really, really powerful, right? It's essentially reproducing, and it may or may not be related to surviving better. So when we're talking about sexual selection, then, we're talking about reproducing and success at reproducing, but reproduction happens within a population. So you have a set of individuals, set of males, set of females, and they're reproducing, but you can't reproduce more than the population has. What I mean by this is, if there are only a limited number of opportunities to reproduce, individuals are going to be competing for that success. So if only you're going to have 10 offspring produced in the next generation, the traits that are most successful are the ones that are going to be in as many of those offspring as possible. So if you have a trait that lets you be the father or mother of all of those 10 and nobody else gets any, you've been very successful, and your trait is going to spread that much more. The point I want to make here is that when we're talking about sexual selection, we're talking about competing against others, and it's against others of the same sex in this first case. So sexual selection within one sex means something like two males competing with each other, and only one of them is going to be successful, and only one of them is going to father offspring. Or maybe one of them will father more offspring than the other. And the example I've got here are a couple of baboons. So at the top we've got baboons because baboons to a primatologist are sort of the ultimate example of males fighting for the alpha position. Essentially what they're doing is ritualized yawning each other. In other words, they're showing their canines, and baboons have such wonderful big canine teeth. Many primates fight with their canines. There's another type of sexual selection, though, that is going to influence how successful an individual is in fathering some of those offspring. And that is, he may win the fight, but does he get to mate? And there are many elements involved here, and obviously it's very complicated, but one of the important elements is that the females would choose to mate with some males and not others. So the other type of sexual selection is sexual selection that happens between the sexes, and it reflects essentially mate choice. Now, we can have sexual selection within a sex, within males or within females. You can have it between the sexes, within males, between males and females, with the choice being made by the females or the choice being made by the males. But typically it tends to go in the direction that I've been talking about. And let me show you what I mean by that. And I will come back to this slide. When we're talking about reproduction, one of the things we have to think about is that the example I used of producing 10 offspring in the next generation, I said, let's say you're the male that fathers 10 offspring, right? You could imagine that, one male producing 10 offspring by mating with, let's say, 10 females. In the case of most primates, they have one infant each. It's a little bit harder to think about it round the other way. That is, one female who produces 10 offspring and other females produce none. And one of the reasons for this is simply the biology of reproduction. So we talk about reproductive potential in terms of how many offspring an individual can produce, either a male or a female. And in mammals, in primates, and in humans, males have very high reproductive potential. They could potentially, doesn't mean they do, they could potentially father many offspring. Right? This is reflected in two things. One of them is the production of sperm, and the other one is the fact that the males do not do the gestation. Males don't get pregnant. We can add to this lactation, that is breastfeeding, producing milk, which is also a female trait. Males don't produce milk. They could, but they don't. When we're talking about this, just to sort of give you contrast of what we mean for humans, we used to use in classes, we used to use Ismail the bloodthirsty. Bloodthirsty might not be the right description. Ismail had 888 offspring that he acknowledged. He had others he did not acknowledge that were born from 500 wives and concubines. Right? We don't use them anymore because we have Genghis Khan. And in modern day, in the modern day Mongolia area, 16 million men are descended from Genghis Khan. Right? So in terms of reproductive output, this is really, really high potential. Right? Obviously, the flip side to this is if you have one male who is producing many offspring, there are going to be other males who are producing few or no offspring. So the two things go together. High reproductive potential goes with highly variable reproductive success. And males essentially are not the limiting factor for females that are reproducing. Like, just sort of a couple of basic facts about males. For example, the average human male produces 1,000 sperm per heartbeat. Okay? Another interesting fact. If you take 1 teaspoonful, 5 milliliters, of semen, the sperm contained in it are enough to fertilize all of the women in the US. Twice. And of course, you'll ask, well, why do men produce so many sperm? And we all know the answer, because none of them will stop to ask for directions. Sorry, guys. Couldn't resist that one. So when we're talking about just the basic biology of reproduction, male reproductive potential is actually very large. And this, of course, continues with age, because males can continue to produce viable sperm and father offspring throughout their lifetime. On the other side of this, if we compare this to human females, as well as non-human primate females and mammalian females, because females, for each offspring that's produced, they're producing one egg or multiple eggs. Excuse me. They then gestate, or they're pregnant, rearing that offspring for 9 months. They give birth. They then produce milk. And in natural fertility populations, the average time of production of milk for each offspring can be several years, 2 to 4 years, before the female will have another offspring. Added to this, that when she reaches, let's say, 50 or so, we get the onset of menopause, and females stop reproducing. So their reproductive lifetime is finite. It takes a long time to produce each offspring. They essentially then have a lower reproductive potential. This is one of the examples of an individual woman who had many, many offspring. It's relatively rare, but it does happen. I believe she had 27 living children. Often, this is a case of multiple births that happen naturally. That is natural inhibition of the normal mechanism that prevents multiple births in humans. There is an example that crops up in the Guinness Book of Records of something like 67 births out of 29 pregnancies or something like that. But essentially, it's nothing like 16 million men. But the point being that female reproductive potential, even at its maximum, is nothing as high as male reproductive potential. But the other part of this picture is that females typically do reproduce, and each one typically reproduces. Even though there's variation between females in how many offspring they produce and the quality of those offspring, most females will reproduce. So the variation between females tends to be lower. You don't have the one female producing 10 and the rest producing 0. You have most of the females will have one birth each breeding season or breeding period, whatever species we happen to be talking about. So that males tend to be highly variable in their reproductive success, or can be, because of this high potential. But females tend to be much lower. So if males essentially then are limited in their reproductive success, what's stopping them? It's going to be access to females in the simplest case. And by the simplest case, I mean where males do not add anything else to the infant other than mating with the female. Okay, and that's an important if. But if that's the only restriction, a male's reproductive potential is essentially limited then by his access to females. Females, on the other hand, are limited by many other things, but essentially, if we look across what non-human primates are limited by, it's primarily access to food. And access to food and access to resources is one of the biggest factors affecting interbirth interval, or the period between births, the ability to have and successfully raise an offspring. So that females, especially when we're talking about non-human primates, we're thinking mostly about access to food. There are many other factors as well, but just in terms of the most important one. But when then females are essentially looking at their reproductive output, each infant is a relatively important part of their potential offspring they could produce. So if a male could produce 100 offspring, each offspring may be a relatively small percentage, 1%. But a female, maybe she's only going to produce 10, each offspring is 10% of her reproductive output. In other words, when we're talking about quality of offspring, females tend to be geared far more to quality, which can include things like choosing a really good male, choosing really good food, and eating well. So females often compete with each other for access to food or access to resources. So back to this again, and showing the writing so you can actually see it properly this time. When we're talking about these two types of sexual selection, we typically recognize that competition within a sex is much more important in males, so male-male competition, competing for access to these females. And the other one, a competition between sexes, is primarily thinking about female choice of male mates. So both of these are elements of sexual selection. Now, this example in baboons is a really interesting one because we have essentially the two types of sexual selection going on in the same species, and in fact, often in the same group. And it may even be the same individual at different points of their lifetimes. The males at the top are playing the alpha male game. That is, they are as big as strong as they can be, and they're fighting to be the top male. So disputes will break out between males. They may escalate to fights until one is clearly bigger and stronger and will take the alpha male position. Alpha male means greatest access to the females of the group. The one at the bottom is taking a very different tactic. Can you see that's a big male cuddled up to a female? This male is making friends. He's playing nice. In fact, that female has an infant, and it's not his infant. And he will actually babysit and care for that infant and groom it and look after it. And he'll groom and look after the female and just basically be really nice to her. When she is ready to mate, there's a good chance that instead of going to the alpha males and mating with the top-ranked male, she may mate with her best friend instead. So these are two different types of sexual selection that can be going on at the same time. They're different strategies. Some males will play the alpha male game, others will befriend females. In general, though, in terms of reproductive success, the alpha male generally fathers far more offspring than any other males in the group, but the friendly male will father more offspring than a male that's played the alpha game and lost. Okay, so he may father a few, the alpha male fathers many, but if you lose the alpha male game, you may father none. Okay. Now we can add a complication to this, because in this sort of currency, economic currency, of value of offspring, we've set it up that males could have many, therefore each one's worth less. Females can only have a few, therefore each one is worth more. But, and this is the complication that comes in when we talk about human evolution, what if males are as limited as females in the number of offspring they can have? And the big thing that limits this male production of offspring in humans and in non-human primates is the need for males to care for the infants. If the infants cannot survive without having both a male and a female caring for them, then even if the male went off and mated with 20 females, all of his infants would die. If he stays home, basically, stays with the female and helps rear the offspring, then they will survive. If this is the key factor determining the number of offspring that are produced and the number of offspring that survive, what we've done is make male and female reproductive potential the same and leveled the playing field. This is an example of a monkey where this is very common. It's a marmoset. Marmosets and tamarins are small South American monkeys. And in fact, the fact that this one is carrying 2 infants, they typically have twins, means that this is probably the male. He does most of the carrying. And this frees the female up to feed and have enough energy to produce milk. And of course, one of the big questions that comes up in human evolution is the role of males in caring for infants. So in humans, we ask the degree to which males are important in rearing offspring, when do they become important in rearing offspring, and the amount of energy it takes to rear offspring. Human infants just suck up that energy, as I'm sure anyone who's a parent knows, especially to grow those large brains that humans have. So they're highly dependent on their parents for extended periods and require high level of investment. Same thing happens in these small monkeys. But what this then does is essentially level the playing field and make both male and female reproductive success limited by the same thing. Now, I keep doing that upside down. There we go. What I want to extend this into then is talking about the evolution of body size. And let me think how I want to do this. When we're talking about, I'm going to turn the lights up for a second. When we're talking about these different features in terms of the degree of competition between individuals, we're often then talking about this 2 extremes, going from high male reproductive potential, where males don't invest in infants and they're competing enormously for access to females, down to the other extreme of being both limited by the same effect. They're both limited by the need of the infants for care. Now, if you go to one extreme, if you go to the males are fighting with each other to get access to the females, what's going to be good for a male, right? What's good in a male for fighting ability? Well, he's going to lose his bottom jaw here. Okay, here's an impressive fella. This is a gorilla, right? See the wonderful canines, very large canines, very big skull, massive, great big crest in the back for attaching jaw muscles to. Little tiny brain, don't worry about that. Males in the gorillas compete for access to females. The bigger you are, the better you are, right? In many, many species. If you have high levels of male-male competition for access to females, what you also would end up with, not are just males are selected for body size, but you get, this lower jaw is definitely going to fall off. Here's the female, right? The male gets very big, but the female doesn't. These are males competing for access to females. So being big is really beneficial. So first of all, a couple of things. One of them is just large body size and large canines as well. Canines in non-human primates, these big pointy teeth here. Now, if we look at something where we want to argue that monogamy is much more important and that males or females limited by the same size, I haven't got a marmoset or a tamarin skull, and they're tiny, so it would be hard to see, but I do have humans here. So we have a nice, robust human male here. Actually, we cheated. We picked the most robust one that we could find. One of the interesting things about humans that happens relatively early on in human evolution is that humans don't have the big canines that our ape cousins do. So this is the male, and this is the female. Now you can see she's a little bit smaller. But in general, when we're looking across primate groups, what we have essentially then is that the degree of sexual dimorphism between males and females reflects the degree to which males are competing for access to females. Okay, so in these bars here, can I do it from here? We have monogamous species in red. Monogamous species, one male, one female, usually both limited by the same need to care for the infants. And that males and females, the axis up here is showing the relative difference between males and females, and being down at 1 means they're about the same size. And this is for canine teeth and body size dimorphism. So if you're in a monogamous group, males and females tend to be the same size because males are not fighting with each other for access to females. If you have either a one-male group, this sort of beigey color bar, or a multi-male group, the blue one, in both of these, males are fighting, competing for access to females, and in both of these, you have relatively high levels of sexual dimorphism. So this is my example of a morphological trait that tells us something about the underlying behavior of the group. Right? The degree of sexual dimorphism says the degree of how much males are fighting or competing with each other for access to females. If we think about this over evolutionary time, sorry, light's coming back up again. We have these guys here, sort of filling in the gap. Now, come around the other side. This is one of the larger Australopithecine males, right? And you can see he's a fairly robust guy. And the female, if we had one in our teaching collection, which we don't, it would be nice if we did, but we don't have one. So the males are relatively robust, and the females are relatively small, pretty much like the gorilla in the degree of sexual dimorphism. These two here, well, let's start with this one. This is someone very famous. This is Lucy. Right? You've probably heard of Lucy, which is a relatively early, human ancestor, an Australopithecine. There's Lucy, a female, a known female. Often it's very hard to sex these guys, but we know Lucy is female. And here is an Australopithecine male reconstruction. Okay, so again, highly sexually dimorphic, big male, small female. In other words, relatively high levels of mate competition among males for access to females. Here we have chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are variable in their sexual dimorphism. We don't have a bonobo in our teaching collection, so I can't bring one of those. Some heavy hints going on here. So this is a chimpanzee, this is the female, and this is the male. Now the male is actually bigger in body size than the female, or they don't look it very much here, but you can tell by the canines. You can see the male canines are very much bigger than the female's canines. And again, for fighting with the canines. And when we get to humans, of course, we're talking about sexual dimorphism, and I promised Josh I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to. Come on, Josh, I'll borrow you here. Let's talk about sexual dimorphism in humans. Right? Here we go. Thank you. So when we're talking about humans, we're talking about a sexually dimorphic species. We're not talking about the same body size. We're talking about males being about 20% larger than females. And in fact, if you look at the range, obviously, I mean, I'm cheating here. Josh is a relatively big male. I'm a relatively small female. And the range of variation could be relatively large. And this is showing females and males from a typical school class, basically showing that even though the two overlap in range, that on average, males are larger than females in humans. Essentially, it implies that although we look across the scale, we'll see that the degree of male-male competition across human evolution has definitely gone down. We are not nearly as dimorphic as Lucy was, or these robust Australopithecines up here. It's gone down in size, and in fact, we are more like chimpanzees in the degree of sexual dimorphism. We're not like those monogamous primates where males and females are the same body size. And of course, this idea that the mating system is essentially evolved over time is generally accepted, as in the Dilbert cartoon from a couple of days ago, actually. Had to get this one in fast as an appropriate one. It says, Dilbert is saying at looks like a cocktail party, I have an actual job and I don't live at home. My offspring would probably be smart. To which the girl replies, my palms are getting sweaty and my heart is pounding. What is going on? And Dilbert says, it's a Darwinian thing. To which she replies, make it stop. Which of course it doesn't. The point that I want to make here is that when we're talking about the evolution of mating systems, we're taking the step away from talking about the evolution of morphology, which is generally easier for people to accept, the evolution of human shape and size, and into the realm of talking about the evolution of human behavior, and especially the human mating systems as an evolved system. We talk about it in non-human primates all the time, but it becomes more difficult when we extend it into humans. And yet I should say, you can collect data on it and you can test for evidence that it's there. So for example, if we take our general setup, the theory we've been talking about, and say, if male reproductive potential is limited by access to females in humans, males should be more willing to mate than females are, right? Essentially, females should be choosier and males should be less choosy. So let's have a look at some data. Now this data across the bottom shows 4 categories, and this is measuring mate selectivity. I can read it off of this one more easily. So this was a study done on our favorite study group, college men and women. So college men differ from college women. Women are in red, the males are in black. The axis going up reads minimum acceptable intelligence of partner, okay, expressed as a percentage. In other words, how intelligent does your partner be before you are willing to first date, second casual sex, third steady date, and fourth marriage partner? Okay, so our hypothesis here was that if human mate choice is evolved, we would expect to see that males with a high reproductive potential should be far more willing to mate than our females, and that's certainly what, especially that second data point, that casual sex data point says. But the other thing is actually there's something much more interesting in this data set, and that is, what happens up here? Down here, we're talking about number of offspring produced, and presumably relatively low quality if we go back to our Dilbert cartoon. But essentially, when you get to the point of investing in offspring, that is, committing to marriages, committing presumably to having children, then males are as choosy as females. Okay, now this sort of application of applying basic Darwinian theory to looking at mate choice in humans, and especially the evolution of human behavior, has been around for a fair amount of time, and it's caused stirs at various times objecting to it. This is from a Time magazine from when it was first proposed as sociobiology. Now we tend to refer it as either evolutionary psychology or evolutionary behavior. Essentially, it can be misinterpreted as some form of biological determinism, that individuals are programmed to behave in a certain way. But that, of course, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a behavioral trait that has evolutionary consequences, an inheritance of those traits. It also gets critiqued or criticized or confused with social Darwinism, which is something very, very different, and that's essentially a misuse of a Darwinian approach, and not something that really is associated with Darwin, but uses the name to imply that because competition is good and success happens through competition, you shouldn't help those who are losing in a competitive situation. But essentially what we're talking about here when we're talking about the evolution of human behavior is we're talking about behaviors that have evolutionary consequences, and of course mate selection does. And this, of course, then led to a whole plethora of trying to reconstruct, to hypothesize about what the mating systems were in each of these various stages of human evolution. And one of the most famous being Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape, and Owen Lovejoy's article on the evolution of human society, and the Hunting Hypothesis book by Robert Ardrey. And it sort of led to this plethora of ideas in especially the 60s and the 70s, talking about man the hunter. And this sort of first wave of trying to reconstruct the evolution of this mating system from what was known at the time of studies of primates to a small degree, but especially those fossils that were around at the time, put a real emphasis on male roles. So these early works emphasized the importance of hunting as a male bonding exercise during human evolution, essentially talking about how males are cooperative and working together, and they extended this to explain the importance of tool use in males who are hunting, intelligence in males who are hunting, and language in males who are hunting, and bipedalism in males who are hunting. There's a certain theme going on here. And that females were left at home to rear the children. So the basic sort of bias of this perspective, of course, was to say that males evolved and females stayed home to take care of the kids. But part of this picture was also then to build in monogamy into a human ancestral mating system. That essentially the point was made that females do not advertise when they're ovulating. We'll talk about this a little more in a minute. So that males have to guard their mates, right? One male guarding one female as a sort of an ancestral mating system. And we can sort of criticize this. Of course, it was criticized very vehemently as being extremely male-centered, and it wasn't supported with the fossils that came along, especially showing that hunting wasn't all that important until relatively late, or all the primate studies that showed of many of these features like intelligence and tool use were things that were done as much by females. And in fact, when we're talking about tool use, like with these chimpanzees who are cracking open nuts using stone tools, it's primarily a female activity. And also the role that females have in choosing their mates. This is not just males guarding females, as it was originally thought. And a lot of the original hypotheses were based on observations of things like baboons. And as chimpanzee data came out, it became more and more refined until we get to sort of a different reconstruction of what was an ancestral mating system, but that still places emphasis on monogamy. So that the proposal is essentially that monogamy you can view as an ancestral mating system in humans because of a number of features. Now, one of these is the role that food plays in the energetics of rearing offspring. Females are producing milk, and milk production takes constant energy in. So that in order to lactate continually and have an infant that survives, a female needs to eat all the time. Hunting doesn't do that. Hunting produces large amounts of food on an unpredictable basis. So males may come back if we have a male hunting, female not hunting model. Males may come back with food, or they may not. If they don't come back, female under this earlier model would not be able to lactate and the infants would die. So by extension from this, it was pointed out that, in fact, a much better way to get a constant energy supply of food is actually to gather foods, and to gather especially plant foods and small animal prey. And gathering as an activity in modern hunter-gatherers is an activity carried on primarily by women and produces as much food as hunting by men does, but it produces it at a constant level. So in fact, gathering is a better way to feed yourself when you're lactating for an infant, and much more likely to produce a surviving infant at the end. It's interesting, though, because that raises the why do males hunt perspective. Hunting is certainly very important, and hunting for animal food was clearly something very different about humans that happened relatively late in human evolution. We know that non-human primates also hunt and take animal food. And that protein source is very important at different times. But if we look at what happens today with men who hunt, when they bring back food, it tends to be shared among all members of a particular group. It is not brought back just to feed their offspring. It's actually shared among, usually typically shared among all individuals. But it's interesting that hunters also, good hunters, tend to have the highest reproductive success in most modern hunter-gatherers. This is not because they're feeding their infants better, it's because females are more likely to choose them as mates. So that male hunting may not be to provide food for infants so much as to be a way of attracting mates. But this hypothesis also includes the concealed ovulation part. The point being that it's often suggested or proposed or discussed that humans conceal ovulation, that is, you don't know when a person is ovulating, and this then led to the need for constant sexual activity as opposed to the mammal model of sex during ovulation and during ovulation only. So constant sexual activity, which essentially reinforces the pair bond, keeps two individuals together to invest in a particular offspring. I also want to add in some more information in a minute when we talk about these different models, that one of the things that then came in after this was new information on the violent behavior of chimpanzees and the aggression between different groups of chimpanzees. So this also has to now get built into our perspective at some point. But first I'm going to do the fun part, and let's talk about the impact that things like bonobos then have on these type of hypotheses. So when we're talking about bonobos, we're talking about our closest relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, remembering that all three of them may have shared an ancestor somewhere between 5 to 6 or maybe 7 million years ago. But most importantly, chimpanzees and bonobos split from each other about 2.5 million years ago. So chimpanzees and bonobos are each other's closest relatives. Humans aren't necessarily any closer related to bonobos than they are to chimps, or vice versa. We are related to both of them equally, even though they are very different. So, talk about bonobos. I've now gotten to the bonobo part, which is my fun part. So bonobos are a species of chimpanzee. They originally called pygmy chimpanzees. They're not pygmies. They're actually the same body size as the best studied subspecies, try saying that fast, chimpanzee. This is a bonobo. Bonobos are born with black faces. Chimpanzees are born with pale faces that turn black as they get older, often with exposure to sunlight. Bonobos have this wonderful hairstyle. This is actually a youngster. He's only about 4 years old. But they have this hairstyle that sort of parts in the middle and comes over the side and hides their ears. Chimpanzees have great big sticky out ears. So they look somewhat different. They sound very different. If you heard a chimpanzee, or if you heard a bonobo, you would know that it was a bonobo. Dare I do this? Okay. I always do this in my classes, and then I regret it afterwards. Okay, chimpanzees. Everyone presumably has heard of a chimpanzee. The classic call of a chimpanzee is called a pant hoot. And a pant hoot goes, right? Chimpanzee. Okay. Thank you. start a group call going. Just watch out, if we get a group going of bonobos, we're going to be in trouble. Bonobos, the same call is called a pant hoot. And in fact, it has the same, if you put it on the sonogram, it has the same structure. Only it's much faster and much higher. It is It does not sound like a great big animal. It sounds like a bird. And yet they're the same body size. So we're talking about a male bonobo. It'd be like a male chimpanzee running about 60 kilos, 60 kilograms. Oh, God, wish I could work that out. 120, 140 pounds, approximately. Sounding about yay high and a lot stronger than a man. So a relatively big animal. They are found only in the center part of the Congo Basin. Here's the central part of Africa. If you look here, you can't see it on this one. Essentially, well, here's the country of Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, what used to be Zaire. And the Congo River itself comes up here and bends over and around like this. If you're north of the Congo River, all across through here and all the way through here, you have chimpanzees. If you're south of the Congo River, this is where you have bonobos. They're found only in the central part of the Congo Basin. And the two are separated by the Congo River, and it's a major separation right about here, which is a wonderful place called Bandaka, which is in the world's largest swamp. The Congo River at this point is about 8 miles across, so it's a substantial barrier. And it's a relatively isolated area. It's primarily forested. It's essentially an isolated population. You can think of it as a group of chimpanzees that were separated off, let's say 2.5 million years ago, when the Congo River made this switch and cut this area off. And they were only relatively recently described in the grand scheme of describing of apes. And for a long time, they were thought to be just another chimpanzee, nothing particularly interesting, only a bit smaller because they were described from a single skull, and it's the smallest skull of an adult that's ever been found. Of course, one of those things. Okay, now, dare we risk? I want to show just a short video. It's like 10 seconds or so. See if this is going to work. Just to look at what they look like. And there's no sound with this, so it's just a clip of bonobos on the ground. And one of the things about bonobos that's different to chimpanzees is they're more gracile in their build. They're not so heavy and stocky as chimpanzees are. Let me just run that one again because it's relatively quick. And if you watch carefully, you'll see the other things that bonobos are famous for, which is sexual behavior. So we have the female here gathering other females in. So this is a female in the middle. They're excited because people and food are coming. Here we have some sexual behavior going on. And there will be some more. Here we go, some more going on in the background. Okay. Now, going back to here. Okay. So bonobos are essentially, I hope you think they look like chimpanzees. They're the same genus. They're Pampaniscus. They are, but they are very different in their behavior. They are found only, as I said, in the country of DRC, Congo. This is the Congo after the Civil War from 98 through to the early 2002. With the area divided into the various factions that now control the country. And this is where my study site is in this forest block up here called the Lomako Forest. And it's a very isolated place, and that's part of the reason why bonobos weren't really studied before now. It's fairly hard to get to. We fly in close to the area in small planes. There's the landing strip right there. Aiming for that one. And then from then, it's a trip by river between 3 and 5 days, depending on how high the river is and how big the outboard motor is and how much it breaks down. And it's essentially a luxurious river trip in a dugout canoe with large barrels of fuel for the motor. And the thing that's interesting for me about bonobos is how they weren't studied that much before. Essentially, when I started in the early 1980s, there had been very little work on them and very little interest in doing them. And even from then on, there has been relatively little media attention paid to bonobos until relatively recently. And then part of that is this isolation, and also the thought they weren't that different, but also the fact that very few media crews were willing to invest the time and effort to go in. So this is my way of saying thank you to the BBC crew that came in and actually made the Nova film. And as you can see, well, they get the good camera equipment, which was really great. But essentially, when you're living for 5 days in a canoe with a bunch of people, it takes a certain amount of commitment to get in and out. And this is essentially what we're doing. And when we get to the rainforest site itself, bonobos are not the only primates there. We have 8 other primate species at this particular site, varying from the little tiny dwarf bush baby and the small nocturnal potto up to the bigger, this is a colobus monkey, and these are different types of African monkeys called guenons, and here's a mangabe. But essentially a wide diversity of different species of primates there, as well as the bonobos. And life in the rainforest is the idyllic field worker's life. We do without luxuries of water or electricity, and essentially camp out with our wonderful solar panel, which we use to run the computer. But the base, and live on local foods primarily. So this is papaya that we can buy locally, and this is manioc. Manioc is a root vegetable that you can eat. It's kind of like potatoes. This is soaking to get the cyanide out of it. It's a cyanide-laden food. You want to cook it first. And then when we're at the site, we've used basic field primatology techniques, which means you take your graduate students with you and you make them climb the trees to measure them, which is what's going on here. We're trying to get an estimate of this tree size. We're talking about a rainforest with the trees, the emergent trees are about 200 feet tall, and the diameter around the trees can be up to 4 meters around, so really large trees. And we're highly dependent, and I've worked forever with the most wonderful local field guides, the trackers, and the field guides that help us in the field in both finding animals, identifying plant species, and stopping us from getting lost. And then, of course, now the wonder of GPS, which has changed our lives enormously in the field. And this is what we do, because bonobos are arboreal. This is one of the main differences between bonobos and chimpanzees, and this is why they're so gracile, is they're up in the trees most of the time, whereas chimpanzees are down on the ground an awful lot. So that clip of the bonobos down on the ground is a relatively unusual one, and it's actually for a particular reason. It was filmed at a Japanese site where they've used food to entice the animals down. We don't do that. We don't provision our animals, so they're up in the trees most of the time. And at the site itself, we have a bunch of different animals. We have 2 communities, and I'll talk in a minute about what a community is when I talk about the difference between chimpanzees and bonobos, and then one little group that we call a splinter group. So we've got 3 units of individuals that we know, and it totals about 60 to 70 adults, plus 15 to 20 infants and juveniles. So a relatively large number of animals, ranging over about 36 square kilometers, which is a relatively large area. Now, bonobos are like chimpanzees in many of the things they do, including their diet and the foods that they eat. There are also major differences between bonobos and chimpanzees in their diet and the foods that they eat, but it's relatively subtle. They're very much like chimpanzees, that they're primarily fruit eaters. Here's the classic tropical fig. This is one of their favorite fruits. I love this one. You probably can't see, but this is a tape measure on the ground, measuring in, this is about 10 centimeters or 20 centimeters. These fruits are like this big, and each one weighs about 40 to 50 pounds. It's the most amazing fruit, and they're really wonderful to watch the bonobos eating them because they share them. But the other thing they have a tendency to do is they tend to take them up in the trees to eat them, and we'll be watching them lying on the ground. So they're sitting up here eating this great big fruit, and we're lying on the ground, and then they start seeing that we're down there, and they're like doing this, and then they just go, you should see us run. We keep saying the biggest danger at our study site is death by fruit. Bonobos, like chimpanzees, they also eat leaves. This is one of the ground vegetations that bonobos like to rip apart and eat. And if you ever want to see what one of these are like, just go to Fred Meyer. Right, in their garden section, the indoor garden section, they have these big leafed plants in pots you stick in the corner. Just rip one of those apart and pull the pith out. And that's the part that the bonobos eat. You can see down here they've been chewing on it. And meat. So bonobos, like chimpanzees, will take animal prey. Relatively rarely, but it does happen. They'll take both small, this is a small antelope, a duiker, but they will also take monkeys occasionally. So the diet essentially isn't that different. The major differences are in terms of the distribution of the diet and the impact that has on the social behavior. So the social behavior of bonobos and chimpanzees is fundamentally different. So if we talk about how are they different, we have to talk essentially about the community structure, but especially actually going back to what we talked about here, and that is the relationship between males and females. Because both bonobos and chimpanzees have the same degree of sexual dimorphism, and it's about the same as humans. Males are a bit bigger than females. It's interesting, in bonobos, it's only in body weight that males are bulkier and more muscular than females. The skeletons actually aren't that different. But both chimpanzees and bonobos, the males are bigger than the females. And if we look at the way, let's start with chimpanzees, are organized, all of these individuals tend to be members of the same community. So when we're talking about the social group of a chimpanzee, we talk about a community. And a community is made up of several males and several females that occupy a common area. This is sort of a representation of the way that chimpanzees are organized. Each of these, pink circles, is a female area. And in that area, there'll be a female with her offspring. So she may have an infant and a juvenile and maybe an adolescent. So it's her immediate family, all of her offspring that are yet to grow up. But she has this core area essentially is hers. And she lives in this area most of her life, except when she's mating. And when she's mating, she follows the males. So this is a female area. But this is also another female area. And this is another female area. So the chimpanzees, the females each have their area, but they overlap with each other. So if, for example, you were to go here and find a really big fruit tree, you could find several females together. But when they finished feeding, they would all go their independent directions. Because in chimpanzees, the food patches tend to be relatively small. If food patches are small, individuals are going to compete for food. And if you remember at the beginning, I talked about how females who are competing for reproductive success are competing for access to food. Hanging out with other females when there isn't much food around is not a good idea. So in chimpanzees, females are not social with each other because the food patches don't allow it. So even though they also eat fruit and leaves, their fruit trees are relatively small and relatively scattered, and the females cannot afford to be social. So the females are scattered, but they overlap with each other. The males do something very different. The males actually defend a range, blue range, that contains these female core areas. And by essentially guarding an area that contains females, they keep out other males. And by working with other males, they can cooperatively protect more females than any one of them could do so alone. And all these males are related to each other. They tend to be fathers, sons, uncles, nephews. When a chimpanzee grows up in a community, if he's a male, he'll stay and become one of these guarding males. If she's a female, she will leave and go to a different community. So these females with overlapping core areas are all unrelated to each other, and the males that are guarding the range of females are all related to each other. So we have essentially a system where males benefit by cooperating with each other to guard the ranges of females. And the relationship between the sex reflects the degree of competition that's going on and also the sexual dimorphism. So here's a big male charging a female, and this female has an infant. You can see her giving a submissive scream and running away. He is getting aggressive. All his fur is puffed up, which is an aggressive dominant signal in a chimpanzee. So chimpanzees, males are dominant to females, meaning that in a fight, a male against a male will win. And in fact, males are very aggressive towards females. Chimpanzee society is a very male-dominated, male-aggressive system, where males will aggress against females and get them to come with them, follow them, leave their core areas, and come with the males when the females are ready to mate. So male aggression is very common, and it can be extremely fierce. And this then has been, in more recent studies, been found to actually extend beyond just aggression within the group and extend to aggression between groups. So this is the extra data that I wanted to bring in, that relatively recently, studies of many chimpanzee populations across Africa have found that not only do these males aggress against females, but they also band together and aggress against the neighboring group. And this happens in a very organized fashion. This is a group of males forming a very organized band that are going on patrol. Now, sometimes these patrols are just going around the edges of the territory, but at other times they go outside of their territory and into neighboring groups. So this is a tight coalition of males. They'll go into neighboring territories, especially if there's a likelihood that they will find lone males, and they will attack and kill those males. So lethal aggression, lethal raiding in chimpanzees has now been described in multiple chimpanzee sites, and it's another feature that's associated with male cooperative activities. Now, essentially, what's happening here, if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, why would males do this? Well, they do it under particular circumstances. First of all, there has to be an imbalance of power in that the attacking group has to be bigger than the group they're attacking, and usually it's because they only attack lone males, or there's a major benefit involved, especially gaining reproductive females, or gaining area of territory. So that if you think about it, if there's another group over here, and the males start coming in and attacking an area and taking over part of this territory, one of the things they're going to gain are the females that live in those core areas on that side. So this dispersion of females is actually part of the picture of why lethal raiding could result in adding females to a particular group. Bonobos don't do lethal raiding. Right? Bonobos don't show aggression against groups. They show many of the features that would leave them open to lethal raiding. That males spend a lot of time alone, which is one of the features that's associated with high frequencies of lethal raiding. You could have imbalance of power situations with large groups meeting lone individuals, but you don't see the type of coalitions that male chimpanzees form, and certainly no coalitions that are based on aggression and violence. And it's interesting because one of the things that we've questioned is why don't they? Would forming a coalition and going into the neighbors and carving out part of their territory give you the same benefit it gives you to chimpanzees? So using the new wonders of GPS, we can now map the ranging of our animals. So if we look at how individuals range, this is a map of our trail system. There's two things going on here. One is the old trail system, all those wobbly lines. That's how we first set up our trails. So we're based on elephant trails, forest elephant. And then with GPS, we can get straight lines now. So we set up a transect system, which is our straight line system. And this is the ranging of one of those three communities in the study area. But what we find is that the females don't have core areas. Females actually range over the whole community area. So even if bonobos were aggressive, which they're not, even if the males formed coalitions with each other, which they don't, if they went into the neighboring group and tried to raid a set of core areas of females, it wouldn't work, because the females aren't in core areas. They're in the whole territory. And in fact, it's the males that range less than the females in bonobos. So we're left with sort of a nice view of bonobos, that they're not aggressive and they don't do lethal raiding. But there are many other major differences between the two. And many of them come back to this issue of male bonding and male coalitionary alliances. That one of the differences between bonobos and chimpanzees is that males don't bond with each other in bonobos. And in fact, the major difference between bonobos and chimpanzees is that in chimpanzees, males bond, but females don't bond with each other. In bonobos, it's exactly the opposite. The females bond with each other, and the males do not. And it all comes down to the relevance of the food source and the food trees. Even though it's all fruit, in the Congo, which is right on the equator, where we don't have much seasonality, we have 3 months wet, 3 months dry, 3 months wet, 3 months dry. And dry means it rains every other day, not every day. Right? So dry is a relative term. You have very high productivity. We have very large fruit trees. There is enough food for females to feed together all the time. So that in bonobos, females can be social. Okay, I'll talk in a minute about why they're social, but females can afford to be social. So we have groups of females that work together. And one of the things that happens is that this then has a consequence on the best strategy for being a male. In bonobos, then, it's the females that are highly social. And one of the things in that clip that you just saw, and this is a still taken from it, is that there was a female pulling in other females. That's something that chimpanzees wouldn't do. Those females are unrelated to her. They're same genetic structure in bonobo groups as in chimpanzee groups. The bonobo females are all unrelated to each other, but they socially bond. The males tend to be with the females, not with other males. So you have groups either of a single male with several females or several males with a larger group of females. The food patches are never small, and the females actually tend to feed first, and the males tend to wait. And the communities are not aggressive to each other. So where in chimpanzees they are actively defending and even fighting and killing each other, bonobo communities are friendly, they interact, they often mix together and travel together for extended periods. Essentially, what we have is then there's no advantage to lethal raiding, right? Because females aren't restricted to core areas, there's no advantage to going next door and grabbing some of their area. But because females are social, it now doesn't pay a male to be social. In fact, it now pays a male to be rather selfish and to have an individual solitary strategy that's much more beneficial than a male alliance. Essentially, a male now needs access to females. So females are not reproductive very often because just like in humans, it takes 4 or 5 years to rear an offspring before a female will be ready to mate again. But getting access to females is now the issue. So think about this in terms of the genetic structure of the group, or rather, let's say you have a system where a mother, an older mother, has a growing son, right? And she's very friendly and social with the other females of the group. But the other females of the group are all unrelated to her, and they're all unrelated to her adult son. In other words, mothers now become social passports for males to get access to young, unrelated females. And individual strategies are now more important. So one male can essentially be associated with a group of these, a tight cluster of females, and keep other males away. He doesn't need to work with other males in order to defend a large area of females. So that you have, instead of being a male alliance to protect a large group of females, you have a cluster of females, and it now benefits a male to use both his alliance with his mother as well as her relationship with other females in the group. Now, there's a lot of discussion when we talk about bonobos and the degree to which these female alliances are important for preventing male aggression. So that females are very friendly with each other and males are not aggressive. Is it that the females are bonding and preventing males from being aggressive? Or is it some other perspective? This is just to remind me to say, this is data. Essentially, one of the things about bonobos, though, is that they are not very aggressive. When we're counting aggressive rates in bonobos, we get maybe 10 aggressive interactions, where if we watch chimpanzees for the same amount of time, we'd be measuring it in the hundreds. So bonobos are not very aggressive. And it may be that female alliances reduce male aggression, or that they prevent it. But I think another way to put it, a much more an easy way to put it, is essentially to say that because the females are clustered together, it's a male solitary strategy that's better, rather than female sociality preventing male aggression. Right? Male aggression has no benefit, therefore it doesn't happen. Not that males would be aggressive if they could, and females prevent it. It's that there is no advantage to male aggression. Okay. It's interesting that if you extend this out to humans, we can talk about different human societies. But there's an interesting comparison that has been made, that in human societies where females have strong alliances with each other, you get much less male aggression towards females, as well as much more political power of females within groups. So essentially, in a cross-cultural study, this was one by Yanko and Lowe, found that women have more resource control and political power when they have, in this case, they were looking at female relatives around them. In other words, the same sort of perspective, that if females have tight alliances with each other, you tend to have less expression of male aggression and male dominance. And just to finish on the final interesting note, this ovulation part of the puzzle and this extended sexuality in humans. People talking about human sexuality often point out that humans don't have sexual swellings, right? We don't walk around with big pink cushions when we're ovulating, unlike bonobos at the top and chimpanzees down below. So the inference was often made that humans lost the sexual swelling over time, right? Because our two closest relatives have them. And therefore, by extension, humans mate all the time because they don't know when they're ovulating. I should say that. Right? So humans don't have a sexual swelling, so they mate all the time because you can't tell. But it doesn't appear that this is true, and it certainly doesn't hold up from studies of humans. Most primates don't have sexual swellings. It's just that chimps and bonobos do. In fact, sexual swellings crop up in weird places in primates all over the place, but most primates don't have them. So it's not something that's would be particularly hard for chimpanzees and bonobos to evolve sexual swellings. All the rest of apes don't have sexual swellings. Gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons don't have sexual swellings. It may be that just chimpanzees and bonobos have these as an evolved trait, a derived trait. The other thing is that when we talk about knowing when you ovulate, we're not talking about it knowing consciously, today I'm ovulating. You may, and many people do, know when they're ovulating, but more importantly, are the behavioral changes associated with human ovulation that have evolutionary consequences? And I've put this one in here to remind me that one of the major changes that happens is changes in dress, as well as changes in behavior. So women who are ovulating tend to dress in more skimpy clothing and be more interested in socializing and going out in the evening. Okay? I think there's potentially some evolutionary consequences to those behaviors. So female behavior changes with ovulation. Female assessment of mate attractiveness changes with ovulation. That female women, when they're ovulating, find different males attractive than when they're not ovulating. In other words, ovulation is not necessarily hidden, but it might not be known consciously. But more importantly, in humans, males can detect ovulation. And they can test this in a number of ways. My two favorite studies, one of them is the famous T-shirt studies, where you ask women to wear a T-shirt and not to use any deodorant or any fragrances for a certain amount of time. You then put the T-shirt in a plastic bag, give it to a man, and ask him to smell it and say, which one is the most attractive? And what will they pick? The ovulating female, right? It's basically a pheromone that can be detected, but also visually. And in fact, men presented with pictures of women who are ovulating versus non-ovulating, same woman, and asked to rate their attractiveness, they will rate ovulating females as more attractive. But even more than that, they will do the same thing shown a 1 square inch picture of the skin. No facial features, 1 square inch of the skin, which is the most attractive female, they will pick the ovulating one. Males can detect ovulation. Yes, we don't have big pink swellings, but we found very efficient ways of doing it. I don't want a big pink cushion. It looks extremely unattractive. They're probably very uncomfortable. So in other words, ovulation isn't concealed in humans. So we can't say that humans have extended sex because they don't know when they're ovulating. And bonobos are famous for their extended sexuality. So an average individual watching a group will see 1 sexual interaction every 6 hours. This is unusual in primates. If we take the extreme, let's say ring-tailed lemurs, a non-human primate, the female has sex for about 4 hours a year, right, when she's ovulating, and that's it. And it may be every other year. A typical chimpanzee typically tends to mate when she's ovulating, and that may be once every 5 years. Bonobos, once every 6 hours. And they're extremely inventive about it. So they have mating in every position and posture possible, including face-to-face mating, all age and sex combinations, except not between related males and females, so not between mothers and sons. And it's innovative and multifunctional, and sexual behavior doesn't include just mating. It includes as many variations of sexual behavior you could possibly think of, and then some, including the most interesting one, which is called Gigi rubbing. That's always the most exciting behavior to see. This is genital rubbing. These are two females, and they're hugging each other. This is a zoo picture, because the pictures in the wild are really hard to see what's going on. They're staring into each other's eyes. This is very significant. A direct stare in most primates is a threat. But in a direct stare like this shows high levels of trust and social bonding. They're giving a bared teeth grin. They'll also be giving a squeal. So I won't try it because I'll bust the microphones. This is the same squeal. It's a sex squeal that males give at ejaculation. So they're giving this extended scream. And they've got one female standing up. The other has got her feet wrapped around the other's hips. And they've got their sexual swellings, let me think, it's about like that, and they're rubbing the fronts of the sexual swellings together backwards and forwards. They're rubbing the clitorises together. Bonobos have enlarged clitorises. So this is an extended sexual behavior between females that's very important in social bonding. And the point here is that sexuality and sexual behavior in bonobos, as it is in many other species of primates where now people have looked more at sexual behavior that doesn't sort of make it into the regular publications, is more associated with social bonding and not with reproduction. So that if we look at a typical female, here's one with a nice big sexual swelling, what they do is they go into something like a fruit tree, they work out how much food is there, they Gigi rub, or genital rub, with as many females as they would need to fill that tree, and then they all feed. And in fact, you can work out how much food is in the tree by how much Gigi rubbing that goes on. It's very strange. But they're making allies and making friendships using this particular sexual behavior. So essentially what we have then is in bonobos, it's best to be a single male, hang out with groups of females or with your mother, and what they tend to do is fight for the best time to compete, but it's a very gentle level of fighting. It's not like chimpanzee fighting. or by forming a special friendship with a particular female. And what this then gives is a lot of social dominance to the females. And essentially, it's not social dominance because in a fight, a male would win over a single female, but you never have a single female. Females always have their friends around, and a group of females is better than a single male, which is essentially what is reducing this level of male aggression. And if we then extend this to humans, and this is what we were talking about before, we would say that in primate monogamy, sexuality is very, very rare. So saying extended sexuality happens in humans because of monogamy and because of concealed ovulation just doesn't fit. Humans don't conceal ovulation, and the extended sexuality is not associated with monogamy in primates. It's much more to do with individual bonding and social bonding than it is to do with reproduction. So from bonobos, we learn sex for friendship, not for the monogamy. We learn the importance of sex, and especially in terms of reducing male aggression, because in male disputes with females, females usually respond by mating with the male, and that ends the dispute. Essentially, we see male behaviors to get chosen by a particular female or to influence female choice, and the power of female allies in the bonobo group. So that what we'd say essentially is that if we're thinking about these as evolutionary models for humans, we can have bonobos. There's more than one way for males to access females. We've got the friendly bonobo way or the aggressive chimp way. There's more than one way for females to be too. We can have social bonobos or asocial chimpanzees, but all of these are in our closest relatives. And essentially then, human evolution included a huge variety of species across a huge area of land where, when we're talking about human societies now, we're talking about a huge variety of ecological conditions, a huge variety in mating systems and marriage patterns. Why should we think there would be one ancestral human mating system? There are many mating systems probably reflecting local ecological conditions, much like modern variety of mating systems and marriage patterns that we see across the huge diversity of modern human populations. So finally, we say that the ancestral human pattern is monogamy, yes, but it's also non-monogamy under different circumstances, but it's basically variable. It varies by the local conditions, it's adapted, and it has evolved. Thank you. Get a bit long. Go ahead. And thank you for your patience, because that went a bit long. But I was having just too much fun. I'd be really